So we have developed a novel approach of on-farm research to evaluate the nitrogen recommendations, especially to be able to develop a variable on-the-go nitrogen recommendations and improve the precision of nitrogen management in Southern Illinois.
Josh McGrath, University of Kentucky. I was lucky enough to partner up with Amir here on this project. And we're going to talk about some of the research. Last year was the first year, or I guess this past year, on precision nitrogen management. And we had sites in Southern Illinois, and then through NREC, and then through the Kentucky Corn Growers Association, also down in Kentucky. So first, just to kind of get us on the same baseline, we generally, at the university level or even within the private sector, we make accurate recommendations for nutrients. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, our recommendations are very accurate. Often I hear farmers or consultants complain and say, I wish we had more accurate recommendations, but that's not the case. Our recommendations are very accurate, they're just imprecise. So they're wrong in every spot in every year, right? But they're on average, over 10 years and 100 farms, they are correct. So what we're talking about here is trying to increase precision. So this figure generally provides a pretty good example of what we mean by precision. These are 3 different field sites, 2008 in Maryland. A friend of mine, Bob Cradville, provided me with this data. And you see that at one of these sites, we were able to get about 215 bushels per acre with no nitrogen, right? So that's a pretty good year. On average, about 40% of our nitrogen response plots show that we don't need nitrogen. The easier example to understand is in that drought year, right? I can get 40 or 60 bushels of corn with or without nitrogen if I don't get any rain. And so there are these non-responsive sites that are very interesting, but often don't help us to inform these average or very accurate recommendations. So we usually end up dropping those sites out. And you can see the error bars indicate the precision, okay? So we're going to drop that non-responsive site, and you can see all of a sudden the error bars, our precision really increases. Those error bars drop down. But even at the low end, if we look where we applied 0 pounds per acre of nitrogen at those other 2 sites, the error bar is still much larger than at the high end, right? And that's, apologies to the microbiologists in the room, but you can't trust the bug, right? And when we apply 0 pounds of nitrogen, that's what we're doing. We're mineralizing soil end and relying on that to supply the crop. And so we have this kind of like yield response function. This is just a simple quadratic, and that's usually what we use to kind of model this average recommendation. And so different set of data. Another colleague of mine, Frank Cole, University of Maryland, again, simple quadratic response function to yield. And we kind of see that it's a diminishing return function. So as we apply more nitrogen, we're getting fewer bushels of yield as we go up. And we're going to apply we're going to look at max yield. So the agronomic optimum nitrogen rate and the agronomic optimum yield, in this case, occurred at 230 pounds of nitrogen and 174 bushels per acre. The economic optimum nitrogen rate and the economic optimum yield is 1 bushel less, 173 bushels per acre, but 25 pounds less nitrogen to get there, right? So that 25 pounds of nitrogen didn't pay for that last bushel using these economics here. So the economic and the agronomic optimum are not the same. So this brings up an important point about the 4 R's. We talk about the 4 R's, right? The right rate and the right time, the right place from the right source. But we often forget to talk about the performance objective, because the performance objective defines what right is. And that's the most important part of the 4 R's. Is it agronomic optimum that we're shooting for? Economic optimum? These are different things. Or the environmental optimum. So in this case, they took soil samples, top meter, post-harvest, measured soil nitrate. So this is the residual soil nitrate, the top meter, post-harvest. And the difference between the agronomic optimum and the economic optimum in this case was 17 pounds per acre of soil nitrate. Okay? So the agronomic optimum, the economic optimum, and the environmental optimum nitrogen rate are very different. And so the difference here is purely a public benefit. So I'm going to get on my soapbox for 1 second and step off as a scientist and give you my opinion. I was with my colleague Bob Nielsen all last week down in Tennessee, and he had a slide that says, everyone's entitled to my opinion, and I thought that was pretty good, so I'm going to steal his line. So you're all entitled to my opinion, but I spent 9 years at the University of Maryland working on Chesapeake Bay policy issues, and the debate is not about transport of nitrogen really from farms. That's not where the debate is. The debate is about who bears the cost of that not happening. because clearly the economic optimum, the agronomic, and the environmental are competing performance objectives. They do not work together. And we have to balance those three things as farmers and as society, and cleaning that nitrogen up is a public benefit. And so that's where the debate is who bears that cost of that public benefit. But we still can do a better job within agriculture. So I'm going to talk briefly about Stanford's equations. Apologies, Dr. Nofziger. I know that there's plenty of people from the Midwest in the room. There's nothing that makes me more nervous than an agronomist that talks about nitrogen. The only thing worse than that is an agronomist from the Midwest that talks about nitrogen. And I'm from the Midwest now. But recently, there's been a lot of publications criticizing Stanford's equation because of this figure. So this is some data from Dick Fox at Penn State. And we see that there's a linear relationship between nitrogen uptake, okay, and yield. No brainer. Take nitrogen concentration, multiply it times yield. You're going to take up more nitrogen with more yield. But the economic optimum nitrogen rate, all right, and that yield don't have a relationship. It's shotgun because there's the other processes. The soil nitrogen cycle is interrupting that relationship. And so this causes a lot of criticism. A few papers have come out recently criticizing Stanford's equation. They're criticizing the rule of thumb, 1.2 times bushels per acre. But that's kind of a, I would say, a misrepresentation of Stanford's point. George Stanford in the 1960s, his paper was not about 1 pound or 1.2 pounds per bushel of yield. That's not what he was writing about. What he was making an argument for was a more mechanistic approach to nitrogen. In the 60s, when he wrote that paper, the way we did nitrogen was multiple field sites, multiple nitrogen rates, what was the optimum nitrogen rate on average, that empirical relationship, the empirically derived optimum nitrogen rate was the university recommendation. And George Stanford argued that if we were going to do better, if we wanted to do better, we had to break apart the mechanisms of nitrogen requirement so that at least on a field-by-field, year-by-year, or within-field basis, we could do better using mechanistic or process-based approaches. No model is purely mechanistic, none is purely empirical. And so, I think we use these hybrid approaches to nitrogen management to try and split apart that plant requirement that comes from yield, but also that soil supply, and so this gets really complex. That's why we don't do it. We have the MRTN in the Midwest. Down in Kentucky, we just use an empirical relationship with credits for soil drainage. And so these things are very complex to derive, especially within a field, across fields, or within time. But I think that if we want to do better, we have to listen to what George Stanford was actually saying in those papers and keep trying to develop more mechanistic approaches to nitrogen management. So Stanford provided this framework, and we have to work to understand the size of the nitrogen pools, how rate and timing of transformations affect that requirement, so that in this case, if we go back to that data set with those three fields, we would recommend that empirically derived relationship, dropping out the outlier field that didn't need nitrogen but got 215 bushels per acre, and that's just the average rate. It's wrong in every single one of those three fields, and that's for just 1 year, 2008. And so what we need to do is work to develop, I believe, these mechanistic approaches that are going on a site and time-specific basis providing that nitrogen recommendation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amir to cover what we are doing to try to get after this.
Well, thank you. Well, hi, everyone. How are you? Are you enjoying this talk? So I'm going to tell you basically how we are approaching this. Depending on the land that we have two approaches. If we don't have a lot of land, basically we are going with this scenario. So we're going to have a starter fertilizer without sidedress versus starter fertilizer and sidedress on top of it. When we have a lot of land and we could do the second approach, basically we're going to split our plots into four basically sections. We're going to have no starter and no sidedress. That would allow us to know how much soil is contributing to the yield potential. We have a starter and sidedress, so we are evaluating the soil contribution and sidedress. Starter only with no sidedress, and also starter plus sidedress. So we end up with, these are the trials that we had in 2019. And for example, in Logan County, basically we had 4 starter rates and 9 sidedress rates. And overall, we end up with 64 plots. to evaluate all those combinations that I showed you. In Illinois, at the two experiment stations, ARC and BRC, Bellevue Research Station, and in Carbondale, we not only we had all those rates, but we incorporated high nitrogen rates at planting to make sure, or basically NDVI readings pick up the differences at V6 and V7 for basically assuming that what the yield, predicting what the yield potential is. And these are the things that we measured. So we measured routine soil sampling at every single plot. We evaluate post-harvest basically to 3 feet depth of sampling to look at the residual nitrogen. We could not do that for every plot. We look at the pre-citrus nitrogen rate. If we had a cover crop, we sampled for the cover crop. We at V6, V7, or V8, we went and basically sensed the crop with NDVI, and then we had the basically corn grain harvested and evaluated the nutrients in the corn. That would allow us to look at the nutrient use efficiencies and nutrient balances. So this is one of the results. We were looking at it. We thought that it's actually pretty telling. So on the x-axis, you can see yield bushel per acre, and that's just for the Bellevue Research Center at SIU. And then on the y-axis, we have the nitrogen balances. So you can see it goes from negatives all the way to 250 pounds of N. What is interesting here is that you can see the differences. You can get 160 bushel per acre with a slightly positive nitrogen balance or 250 pounds of N balance. And that's what we're trying to figure out, how to reduce these excess N balances and get the yield to be more efficient with using nitrogen, basically with our approaches. So when we put all our data together, every single point, and that's the yield response to nitrogen across all the sites, preplant nitrogen and cover crop, we had economic nitrogen rate of 268 pounds per acre and the economic yield of 231 bushel per acre. When we basically divide this by site and cover crop, you can see that the N basically nitrogen, optimum nitrogen rate recommendation range from less than 200, 170, all the way to 260 and 70. So we have a range of 100 pounds differences depending on the site with cover crop or without cover crop. And I think that's the most important or conclusion slide, is that this is just 1 year data. When we look at the yield response by nitrogen, by site, by cover crop, and pre-plant nitrogen, when we had 3 sites and 3 cover crop and multiple starter nitrogen rates, or basically optimum yield range from 128 to 342 bushel per acre, or economic optimum nitrogen rate range from 99 to 330 pounds per acre. And I think that's basically tell you that we need to move toward the more mechanistic approaches to manage nitrogen within our system. So our goal is to develop algorithms for the on-the-go variable nitrogen management. Once we do that, we hope that we can validate it through on-farm research trials, team up with the farmers, do on-farm trials, and see if it works. I think after that, we are also very interested to evaluate how this variable rate nitrogen management versus flat rate would allow us to look at environmental end losses, leaching, or basically nitrous oxide emission, and whether it's economically feasible for growers. So with that, I would like to thank NREC for funding our project. We really appreciate it. And the people that helped us, our technicians, Randy Lang and Jean Hahn, our PhD student, Amanda Whitehoner, and our 2 co-PIs are here, John and Carl. We would be happy to answer all your questions, and thank you so much for paying attention to us.